Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the fourth and final BCT webinar of 2022. Can you believe Christmas is just around the corner? Goodness gracious. I hope everyone has made it through quite a tumultuous year. And with the big wet that's going on in the Central West right now, we hope everyone is safe and can look forward to spending time with family and friends over the coming summer. It's me again, Joel Stibbard, an ecologist at the education team here at the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, or the BCT. In my role, I have the pleasure of informing landholders and the public of the values of private land conservation and help build a conservation community within which we can all learn ways to understand and protect our natural world. And today's webinar provides a means for us to do just that. So thanks again for joining. So before we get started, as always, would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we're meeting today, recognising their ongoing connection to land, waters and culture. I'm here on a Wabakal country, if I can get it out, in Newcastle, and I know we have people calling in from right across New South Wales and possibly even further afield. I pay my ultimate respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us today. And a lot of what conservation land management is about is restoring ecosystems to the natural wonder that our traditional owners have been able to sustain for thousands of years. This webinar looks at how we can tackle the challenges that we face in doing that by first planning and prioritising management actions. And today's focus is on weed management. For many areas facing rampant weed growth after all the rain, it's important to maximise efficiency in how we implement control actions. So it's going to be good stuff. Here we are. So we're going to mix things up a little bit. We're going to show a fancy little video that we've put together that highlights the topic of today and introduces our illustrious guests. It very much speaks for itself, and I've said too much, as always. So with no further ado, here's the video, and I'll see you on the other side.
So when we first got here, there were a couple living here in a very low-tech way. So there were a few shacks on the place, an old racehorse, lots of veggies and fruit trees, and a lot of weeds down the bottom in the gully and up around the property. I suppose the first thing was I didn't know what I was looking at. So when we first looked at the property and went down to the natural areas, the creek lines and the gullies, I wasn't really even sure what a weed was and what was supposed to be there and what wasn't. And to me it looked like a beautiful lush rainforest. But after being here and speaking to local people and some of the networks that I was exposed to later, I very quickly realised that a lot of those lush green leafy things I was looking at were actually privet, lantana and a bunch of other ground and vine weeds. So that was quite overwhelming at first to realise this pristine bush block that I thought I'd bought was actually chock full of woody and grassy weeds. So when I sort of found out the scale of the weed infestation I had here and how tricky it was to control it, I was fairly overwhelmed because I really didn't know where to start. So I started off with the Land for Wildlife program, which was organised through our Nambucca Valley Land Care. So we had a really experienced operator who came out to the property to have a look around and evaluate our area, and that was a really important first step for us. I did a lot of Googling and a lot of YouTube and a lot of talking around people that I met new in town, but until someone came and put boots on the property and was able to help me actually understand what tree was what and what areas were important and where to best prioritise, having that experience really clarified and made my vision of what we could achieve much more tangible, because I could see from someone who's done it before and who has overcome massive problems like this, that maybe what I thought was a big issue, for example, big broad scale lantana, maybe that wasn't too bad. Maybe that was actually quite an easy thing to control, and that I should be focusing my efforts on some of the woody weeds that were quickly dominating the riparian zone. The first mistake I made was trying to do everything by hand and hand pull acres of lantana. Very quickly, even being quite young when I moved up here, just the physical act of hand pulling is really difficult on your body. It's very easy to put your back out, and I did it myself even though I thought I was fit and strong, and then that slows you down for a lot longer and nothing else is possible if you're injured. So over time, talking to people, learning more about different options in terms of control and exploring chemical control and researching it myself and better understanding the pros and cons and why it was the best option for my property. That opened up so much more time for me because I was able to control big areas quickly, and it meant that I was able to do more follow-up and more impactful bush regen work, and then focus the bulk of my time on the more fiddly cut and paint, drill and fill type woody weed control, which is really where it's time consuming and there's no sort of fast, easy solution for that type of work. I'm fortunate that I had access to lots of tube stock through my employment, and I was able to put a bunch in, and really the focus of that was to revegetate areas that had very little natural regeneration, no canopy, to stabilise an eroding creek bank where we needed to get some of those good stabilising species like lomandra and water housias and water gums into the system as soon as possible. And then also because we wanted to increase the diversity, because this is a fairly degraded landscape, and the sooner we can get a higher species diversity in, the better long term. And a lot of those keystone species are missing from these gullies because of the long history of logging, fire and disturbance, which has added up over time. Having a property plan and a plan in general, it doesn't have to be a really well structured 20-page report, but having an idea written down where you can have an overview of the property and think about the staging of works is absolutely essential. When you come into this, buying a block or having a bigger property, particularly if you're new to it, it can very quickly be overwhelming, and it's really difficult to put all this energy into the right spots. And I've seen it before and I've felt it within myself. Burnout is a lot of people are vulnerable to burnout, including myself. You put all this energy in and you're just treading water, or just keeping up with the chores and not actually pushing ahead. And bush regen and environmental management is really about people management. And if you're thinking about yourself, it's managing your own time and your own energy and your own thought process. So the focus really has to be about the process, not always thinking about the outcome. If I just get rid of those weeds, then it's going to look beautiful, or if I just finish planting all those trees, then we're going to have the best forest in the world. It's about appreciating it for how it is now, thinking about the role those weeds potentially are playing, and then thinking longer term, how can I slowly improve that? Because if you always look at everything as a weed and as a problem, you don't actually get to enjoy your property very much. You go down to these really beautiful areas and you think, once this is finished, I'll be happy here. But the idea that we're fixing 100 years of degradation in a year or in a season just isn't realistic. So building confidence by having little wins, tackling a little area where you can see some good regeneration coming, is really the best place to start. And by having that documented either by yourself, by a professional that comes in from the BCT or from Landcare, or a private bush regen contractor who can help you understand and evaluate those goals and help you see that with more clarity, is really, really important to start that process and to make sure that all the energy you put in is getting the most bang for buck.
That's fantastic. How good's that? Such fantastic footage to illuminate the challenges many of us face in land management. There's a special thanks there to Colin at Numeral Creative who put that together for us. So good. And that video showcased both of our illustrious presenters today. So we of course received gold nuggets of advice from Conservation Agreement holder Logan Zingus, and he's here. But we also caught a glimpse of North Coast BCT ecologist Liz Brown, who's really been the brainchild of today's webinar. So special thanks to Liz. She'll now take the reins and present alongside Logan on property planning, vegetation and weed management. Following the presentation, we'll have Q&A like always, with both Liz and Logan ready to tackle any tricky questions you might have. There's a chat window on the side of your screen, so pop the questions in there and we'll do our best to get them answered. So take it away, Liz.
Thanks, Joel. So yeah, it's great that you could all join us today, and I just want to go through a few basic principles to get everyone thinking about weed management plans or vegetation management plans for your property. And firstly, I just want to acknowledge that we filmed that great video on Gumbaynggirr country on the mid-north coast where we all live and work, and to pay respect to all the First Nation groups across the country. So we have a lot of landholders come to us who have a real sense of overwhelm. They've got so many weed management tasks and other tasks across their property, and they try and do it all by themselves, and they try and do it all at once. So today's about creating management zones on your property and talking about some common planning issues that we all come across. And the ways that you can make a real difference, but acknowledging that you've got limited time and limited resources. And so a few things to start off with. Side areas and how we time our works. So you'll probably have more than one kind of area to manage on your property. You might have, well, you will have remnant bushland. It could be old growth or regrowth. You'll have maybe a creek or a river or a wetland or a rocky area or steep slopes. And you'll have maybe some previously disturbed areas. And then on to timing your works, thinking about breaking down manageable chunks across time that you can actually start to feel more organised and more in control of things on your property, which is so important, to think about what to do first and what you can leave until later. And what you'll need to do based on seasonal conditions and the weather that you can expect across each year. So we've had La Nina, we've had some full-on flooding and wet conditions for several years, and that's impacted so many landholders with access and being able to get to what they want to do, and also the availability of contractors and all those flow-on effects. Here on the north coast, we're in a subtropical region, very hot summers, very humid conditions for working in. So timing your works is a really important part of planning ahead. This slide's about thinking about your aims, what you want your property to look like. So we're assuming that you want to enhance different types of bushland on the property. We call that assisting native or natural plant regeneration. So basically bush regeneration techniques where we release the pressure of the weeds from an area and allow the soil bank to regenerate the native seed that's already there. Also thinking about what kinds of weeds, whether they're noxious or, nationally significant, or whether they're more environmental weeds. And all weeds have different control strategies that are appropriate to them. You might want to increase native fauna features across the property. You might want more hollows for tree-dwelling species, log habitat for ground-dwelling species, or maybe coarse woody debris in riparian areas, which is missing from your property. And also widening edge areas is really important. So disturbance has left us with high light conditions that favour weeds on the edges, and you can use revegetation or planting with natives, but it's really important to only do that in certain areas where you really need to, and to use the native plants that actually belong in that vegetation type and not in a different one. So weed management, this is about a more staged or strategic approach on your land, and I'll just talk through how to develop some really basic weed management zones, which obviously just means different zones need different management actions. So on this photo you can see on the east side of the bank there's intact native forest, and on the west side highly disturbed zone which has got some lime green camphor laurels, and the landowners here have been doing native revegetation or planting work to try and stabilise that side of the bank. And I'm going to hand over to Logan, one of our great landholders, while we look through some drone footage, just of a degraded riparian area, and then one that's just different management zones across a landscape. So over to you, Logan.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, so here we have the classic degraded river or creek landscape here on the north coast, where you can see, as Liz mentioned, all that lime green, beautiful lush foliage is actually camphor laurel. And we've got all sorts of actions going on with bank erosion. We've got the start of gravel buildup and casuarinas colonising the channel. But clearly this channel is much larger than it would have been in the past, and there's very little native vegetation. And we see a site like this, and many landholders up on the north coast, if they have some river country, will have something like this and will have some degree of bank erosion. And erosion is probably one of the most alarming and difficult problems on a farm, because you're losing land actively. And it's one of the most prime possessions and prime parts of any property is your river. And if you're losing it and you're losing your alluvial flats, you're going to be quite concerned. But there's lots of things you can do about it. So good thing is to take a deep breath and to think about it in a really strategic way. And in river restoration, they say rule number one is that rivers erode. It's a natural process, but that's very difficult to think about and hear. But it still means that we need to understand that how it fits in, how our property fits in with a broader landscape. And each one of our properties has a little reach that's part of a much bigger system. And while it might be eroding in one area, it's degrading in the others. So here on the Nambucca, as with many on the North Coast catchments, we have a long history of clearing the last 100 years, and also gravel extraction and stock access. And they also de-snagged the rivers. So that's led to this channel expansion, so a much bigger river carrying a lot greater volume of water, moving faster and on a steeper slope, and that exacerbates the problem. So it's these compounding domino effects of erosion. And that's the bit you've got to take a deep breath at, because it's a big, long history that we have to fix. And here again, we have another important landscape to protect. But thinking of this creek system, the first thing you can do in the first step is to exclude stock if you haven't already. And on a rough rule of thumb, 2 times the bank height is how far you want to move your fence back, because that bank is generally going to erode back to a gentle batter. And then the next thing you have to do is think about your strategic weed control, so slowly removing those weeds, and then look at your revegetation. And really the last step is structural works. So many people want to jump to putting rock from the toe to the top of the bank, but that's not the best outcome. It's very expensive and difficult to do in the long run, and we can't have rock line channels, otherwise we'll end up with canals and we'll lose all that great biodiversity that we have on the north coast. If you do need help with that, it is a really good idea to get experts in to have a look as well. I did want to mention something about this wetland area, because often wetlands are very underappreciated on properties and farms. But in terms of their importance in the landscape, these are the food factories for our estuaries and for our oceans. 80% of the food for fish come out of wetlands and mangroves, particularly coastal salt marsh and this casuarina, I think this is casuarina forest here. So, and often we see them just grazed without any protection at all. They offer very low feed value, and these are the engine rooms of our river landscape. So one of the easiest thing we can do is exclude stock in these areas, and they're also incredible carbon sinks. We store much more carbon in our mangroves and salt marshes than we do in our forests as well. So really important assets to have on the farm.
Thanks so much. So now I'm just going to take us through quickly the kind of weed management zones you might see on a typical property. This is just an example property. If you were to hire an experienced ecologist or bush regenerator to actually write a weed management plan or a vegetation management plan as a document that's tailored to your property, you would see a map just like this in it. So zone 1, you can see the green area is just intact forest. So it's going to have a lower level of weed control needed both initially and over time. It might have scattered privet or lantana or camphor laurels across it. But over time, you've got to keep onto it and watch out for weeds that are spread by birds, wind, downslope by or other animals coming in. So the next zone, zone 2, is the yellow part around the highly cleared area on the property. And these are the edge areas I was talking about before. These might happen along a track or something like that, or along even a riparian or waterway area. So this is a disturbed forest type, which will have a much higher level of weed control required. And you'll probably need to do a bit of revegetation or planting of native species that actually belong in that forest type in areas that don't have any remnant canopy. And then zone 3 could be something like up in the northwest corner. There's the brown area, which could be a threatened vegetation type, such as a freshwater wetland. You'd probably have a lower level of weed control needed here over time, but there are very different site conditions to the surrounding forest on lower lying areas like gullies, waterways, things like that, wetlands. Much more delicate soils because they're inundated periodically. And so the way that you manage weeds in that area would be very different, and you'd also get a very different suite of water-loving species. And in zone 4, finally, just down the bottom half of the property, the blue area shows us a waterway or a drainage area which crosses from the east into the property. It'd have typically a much higher level of weed control needed over time. And very different site conditions again, like the eroded banks and new weeds coming in downstream from the east into the property. So you'd need to learn over time how to manage each new weed as it came. You might need some revegetation again for areas that are degraded or have no canopy. And you can see the white line along the east and the southern boundary of the property, where the landholders fenced out cattle or livestock from entering those pasture areas to the east. So that's just what a general weed management plan with zoning might look. It's quite simple to do. It's just that a lot of people haven't seen one or they haven't considered it before. So another thing is what's going to happen after you control the weeds, what's going to grow back. There are a few things to think about. So different areas across the property and what quality or condition that they're in, and rate them whether they're low or moderate or highly affected by weeds. Like we said before, the physical features of different areas, they might be rocky, they might be next to a wetland or a creek or a river. And is there a remnant canopy? We go on about this a bit, but it's very important. Because we don't encourage revegetation if you don't need to do it, because it costs you a lot of money, it takes you a lot of time, tree guards, all that kind of thing. If there's a native seed bank and some canopy, it'll regenerate for you by itself if you just are patient and give it time. And again, obviously, the different weeds in different properties and different areas of your property. You might have a monoculture of, say, lantana or a vine, like in the top picture, which takes over all the trees and cracks them and pulls them down with its weight. Or you might have lots of mixed species, like different grass weeds and annual weeds. Or along a creek, you'd have your more water-loving weeds, and they all need specific management, and a specialist can give you that advice and help you along. And also to consider if you've got any threatened plants or animals or vegetation types on your land that you might not know about, or you might know all about them. They need special management sometimes. And again, specialist advice and help can really be a benefit for those special entities that you're the steward of. What's the disturbance history of your site? Was it recently burnt in the bushfires? Was it flooded during La Nina? Has it been cleared in the past, grazed by livestock, or has it been selectively logged? And so it's missing key species that used to be much more common in that forest type. And some ideas for approaches to management on your land. So weed control is obviously the primary control when you first get started, and the infestation's really high. But equally important is follow-up or maintenance control over the years, because unless we do that, we may as well not even have bothered. It'll all just come back. Ecological burning is something that some property owners consider as a management tool, and that can help to stimulate regeneration from native species that were adapted to fire. And again, native plantings from the specific vegetation type that you're in. It's good to look at what your expected outcomes or timeframes are. Do you want to achieve total weed eradication? Is that even possible? Or do you just want to reduce a weed load in a certain key area? Or do you even want to leave certain weeds which are less invasive and less of a threat in some areas where they serve a purpose, like holding a bank together or providing, say, bird habitat, while you do weed control around them or do things like revegetation or planting? And the concept of adaptive management is critical. So say you developed a weed management plan for your property over looking at periods of time like 1 year, 5 years, or even 10 years or more. You would review that document after, say, 5 years and see what has worked and what hasn't, and then update or adapt that plan to integrate what you've learnt from your past experiences and change what you do for the benefit of biodiversity. So the grants program can really help you and other programs in your area. You can access funding from the grants program to hire experienced contractors and specialists to come and do bush regeneration either with you or for you if you can't do it yourself anymore. Fencing out areas from livestock, erosion control on slopes or waterways, or you can hire an experienced ecologist or bush regenerator to write one of these management plans tailored to your property. And the final slide just shows us there are so many places to go for more information. I've just listed a few here. The BCT has a website with some great resources and guidelines. You can email us or call our 1300 number, or you can even write to us in the mail. The DPI has some incredible resources. I've just named a couple here. The Weed Control Handbook is amazing. Weedwise, you can get that as an app on your phone or the website, so you can identify what your weeds are and how to control them. LLS has got some excellent programs to tap into, and I've just included their email there for further contact. And Landcare, join a local Landcare group or ring up the office for advice. And there's a website there to help you find your local group or office. So that's all from me. Thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Liz and Logan. You can really see how, breaking the property up into management zones is a great approach to, to tackling these issues. And you mentioned adaptive management, like it's crucial, right? It's not only assessing how, well the management's going and change things if you need to, but also, to be able to change the management zones, because over time, of course, they will change as the land responds to the good work that you're doing. So that's fantastic. All right, so look, I've got some questions here. They've come flooding in, excuse the pun. And look, first of all, we'll start with a question from, we've got Graham Watson. It's a particular question about the treatment of Hypoestes phylostachya, and I don't know that species, and perhaps, hopefully you guys do. But he says, I've found glyphosate sets it back, but only for it to rebound in far greater numbers. So perhaps there's a bigger question there around, weed treatment, chemical use, and, how to sort of combat those as they continue to sort of push back.
Logan, do you
Anyone?
have any input on that one?
I don't have any different ideas in terms of, because really the chemical use should be all listed through the APVMA. So when we're looking at what chemicals can work on different species, using the DPI weed-wise resource is really important. And clearly when those things are bouncing back, it's not necessarily because it's bouncing back as a response to the chemical. It's probably because everything else around it potentially has been killed and that's all that's left and hasn't really been set back. But unfortunately, I don't have anything concrete on that one.
I would just recommend using a bush regenerator if you're not already. Maybe they can suggest some different mixes of herbicides that are appropriate for that weed.
Okay. I will mention too, I don't have it with me, but there's a really good resource that DPI have produced called the Weed Control Handbook that mentions, that's got a list of all the different species, well, so many different weed species and alternative treatments. It's for, tackling weeds in bushland situations. And we find that's a great resource as well. So that might help. But again, we can provide some further information and get back to you in upcoming sort of emails, follow-up emails here. All right, sorry, I'll keep going. Anonymous asks, is there mapping available of where threatened species occur and also where important vegetation ecosystems occur? Liz?
I can answer this one. So the Trees Near Me app, if you've heard of that, is really good. It's quite the mapping's not perfect, but it's a really good start to try and identify what vegetation community you're in, including threatened ones. So yeah, Trees Near Me, you can get that on your phone. And BioNet or the Atlas of Living Australia are two really good online resources for finding threatened entities. So you could check those out as well, including the Protected Matters search tool. That's another one for federally listed species and entities.
Okay, great. That's awesome. Yeah, that Trees Near Me stuff is really good. It's quite new and very cutting edge stuff. So that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So Peter Hall is asking what to do about weeds over the boundary, particularly when neighbours aren't as keen on weed control. Rights and responsibilities ? Ooh, tricky. Dealing with the neighbours. What about you, Logan? What have you found dealing with your neighbours, mate? Yeah.
Yeah, well, the one thing I can definitely say about neighbours is they're probably your most important asset when you're living in the property. So it needs to be negotiated with care and very thoughtfully, and not with a heavy-handed approach. There are biosecurity duties, so people have responsibilities to manage weeds on their property, and that includes certain buffers around boundaries as well. And the best way to find out specifically is to talk to your local weeds officer. So every council will have a local biosecurity or weeds officer, and those sorts of people go around to most of the properties in that LGA, and will have a pretty good idea of who's where and what the sort of and how much you can push it back. It is a difficult thing, and obviously fence lines are one area where you have a bit more ability to clear and to manage around. But otherwise, my suggestion is to really approach it quite sensitively, and then also talk to your local weeder or weeds officer.
Awesome, great, Logan. And there was a question there from Maggie as well, which was very similar around sort of boundaries and working with neighbours. So it's obviously a common theme, and hopefully we've provided some good advice for you there too, Maggie. Awesome. So Louise is asking here, we're on a 5-acre semi-rural bush block, and have had to clear a 40-metre radius around our house to comply with APZ requirements. We now have heaps of weeds, ochre, devil's fig, lantana, etc., sprouting. Who would an appropriate specialist be to be able to help us to bring the weeds under control, and where will I find one? We're on the Queensland-New South Wales border, so up your way, and a council grant or something else? I assume the site 5 acres would mean that it's too small for an agreement with us, but yeah, sorry, go Liz.
Yeah, I'm not sure about council grants. It would be worth calling council if they have an environmental officer and talking to them about your options. The LLS may be able to help you in that area. So you could Google their website and get in touch with them. Yeah, the block's a bit small for what the BCT is looking for a conservation agreement. But also the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators, or AABR, has a list of, you can search their list of approved bush regen contractors per area, and you can find out what's available in your local area. So it sounds like you might need a contractor.
The other option, I think, is if you've got talking about grants or access to funding is through the Land for Wildlife program. And Logan, actually, you mentioned in the video Land for Wildlife, didn't you, mate? And that was sort of your entry into that. Can you speak a little bit about Land for Wildlife, mate, and how you found that out?
Sure. Well, that was through the local landcare group, Nambucca Valley Landcare. It's a voluntary, non-binding agreement, but it allows you, and essentially it's an in good faith agreement that you're going to manage part of your property for bush and for nature. And through that, you get access to the Conservation Partners Grant, which is run through the BCT. In that particular case, because that APZ is not actually a natural zone, I don't think that would be included in the management area. So I probably would say it'd be difficult to attract funding because really all you're trying to have there is low growing species, which maybe not represent a natural area. So I think it'd be difficult to get a grant to tackle the weeds in that area. But for the rest of the property, I think the requirement is 2 hectares. So you just about you'd fit in there with the 5 acres if you've got plenty of bush on there. So that'd be something I consider. But also in your APZ, you just have to think about what's your longer term plan on what that vegetation is. Is it grass? And if so, is it something that you can mow and manage, or you can use animals to manage it? Because the ground fuel layer is the important thing to consider. So it's not about having just 0 trees in an APZ. In fact, some trees can be helpful because it shades out those weed species coming up. And you don't just have a single monoculture, but really you need to replace those weeds with something, whether it's a perennial grass or something else that you can manage easily.
Yeah, that's key, isn't it, Logan? Is that idea of replacing it. Like if you just tackle the weeds and leave bare ground, you're just more likely for the weeds just to come back. So you need to sort of put something in its place, and that's where those native ground covers are really beneficial to sort of, take that space up. Fantastic, mate. Thanks for that. Julie is asking, do you know if there's some kind of app or something that we can use to identify where we find a weed when moving through our property so that we can come back at another time to manage it? I think that's as much about just tagging the location, I think, as much as sort of the actual weed itself, although.
Yeah, a lot of people like to use Avenza, which is spelled Avenza. And that's a mapping program you can download onto your phone or an iPad. And that's a really good way of making point locations as you move around your property and making notes. So that can be a really easy way to do what you're asking. And there's also things like iNaturalist, which some people use to record weeds. And I believe that gives you a location. When you take a photo of the species, it gives you the date and the time and the locality of where you recorded it. So they're 2 I can think of off the top of my head.
Anything, Logan? What have you used, mate?
Pink flagging tape is probably my best resource, and something that if I'm going out in the bush, I always have some flagging tape with me. Avenza is a second for Avenza as well, and Google Maps as well. It helps you find out and where your property boundaries are, particularly when you're way out in the bush. But I mean, I guess in essence, depending on how big your property is and what sort of weeds you're managing, if the weeds you're identifying are so small and insignificant that you have to mark it on a map to come back, it probably isn't. It may not be your most important point to work on. I guess if you're way out in the bush and you've just got a few weeds coming up and you need to go back there and tackle it, that makes sense. Or if it's a really critical or important weed that could be getting out, But often the places that I've been to and that I've seen, the really important areas are pretty obvious.
Yeah, great point. And to just back up Liz on Avenza, we actually at the BCT in the early days before we sort of had our own spatial system set up, we were using Avenza ourselves in the field. It's a fantastic resource. It does
Really
require
good.
though for like a PDF map to be produced at the first instance, but if you had like somebody that was able to, like, you know, a consultant contracted to produce that map for you, a GIS map, then you can load it onto Avenza, tag locations, take photos at those locations. It really is a great resource, and
Yeah.
free for, you know, a few maps as well to be able to have on that,
Yeah.
app. So that's really good. Fantastic advice as always. Thanks, guys. Maggie has asking about the preferred treatment of balloon vine. I believe balloon vine is something you guys handle up north, yeah?
Yeah, we sure do. There's a few ways you can attack it. You can hand pull little baby seedlings. You always try and get to it while or before it's flowering, so it doesn't form those papery capsules which fly around and float around everywhere. You can frill around if it's up trees really thickly. You can actually just skirt the tree and cut them so all the above where you cut parts, if that makes sense, will die. And then you can use herbicide to actually spray parts on the ground. But again, you would use someone that has a license to use herbicides and who's experienced in that space.
Great. Anything to add, Logan, or Liz nailed it?
Oh, absolutely nailed it. Yeah, I mean, balloon vine is also one of those things that the fruit's actually quite easily to collect because it's that big, you know. Oh no, I'm thinking of moth vine actually. But when you're thinking about the vines, balloon vine, the reason they're so impactful is because they can shade out and they don't mind shade and they'll take out mature trees. So definitely vines are high up on the priority list and one of the trickier ones to deal with. I have seen people try, which is an off-label usage of things of herbicide, where they stick the vines in a little pot of the herbicide so it can soak it up and kill what's the residual left in the tree. Particularly, people use that on Madeira vine. Again, that's off-label, and I've found that it's very time-consuming, and it's actually there's quite a lot of risks there because you're essentially leaving open herbicide bottles around the farm or down at the riverline. And what I think is better is to kill it, like Liz said, curtain it, kill everything above, and then deal with what you've got left on the ground.
Great. Thanks, mate. There's a question here from Vicky. I'm wondering if you guys will have come across this species, as it seems to be a more of a western or grassy woodland style species. Cineraria loratiformis. Advice needed for control. All other weeds controlled very well, but Cineraria is leaping ahead. Have you guys had any? I don't know the species. You guys know it?
So it's a daisy, it's similar looking to fireweed, which we get a lot of around where we are.
Okay.
I would have thought herbicide spot spraying or slashing would be the go. I know with those daisy species that they can germinate even after the flower head's severed from the plant. The flower heads that lie on the ground can still germinate. So if you're slashing, you have to try and do it when it's not flowering, or you have to somehow pick up the flower heads and bag them and dispose of them elsewhere. But again, I would always use someone licensed that knows what they're doing with that particular weed species in your area.
I don't have any
And
experience with that particular
sorry, go, mate.
weed. Sorry, just come in. But I think that some of those may have affected more of the agricultural networks in the area. So you're saying, I saw the comment saying LLS were unaware of it, but potentially those agricultural networks would have been managing it for a while, and their industry groups often have a lot of information out there too. So whether it's wheat or whatever, if there's broadacre out there, they might have some advice on it that hasn't yet, if it's a new weed that hasn't yet made it to LLS.
Okay. Yeah, more weed questions, which is perfect. It's what we're after. From Matt asking about weeds deemed controllable or otherwise. Can you please talk to that, and particularly species such as grasses that may be very difficult to completely eradicate?
Logan, did you have anything to add?
Well, grasses are very difficult. They block succession. So in our case, it'd be broadleaf paspalum is the grass that comes in there. And once we kill canopy weeds like privet and camphor, broadleaf is one of the first ones to step in there. When we talk about controllable or otherwise, there's a lot of analysis and scientific data that goes into figuring out what scale and how we rate weeds and whether they're what risks they are, and some are deemed almost naturalized. When we talk about camphors and up here on the north coast as an example, and don't have as much attention or focus put on them. But in your property, those might not apply for your property specifically. So just because something is so rampant up here, you may be able to tackle that on your small section, given that you put it given that it's in your long-term strategy. But grasses, besides just crowning and hand pulling and those, it's fiddly work, and it's going to be fiddly work. But it all comes back to what is going to take its place. And canopy is the first thing, shade it out. So trying to get those pioneer species growing. For us, it's things like acacias and red ash and a lot of those really first species. The pioneering species that come up and shade everything out. And then once we get a canopy, and if things are still coming back, then we need to consider how we're going to get rid of that grassy layer.
Yeah, and I'd just probably add that there are manageable weeds, which is a name that they call them, or high threat weeds, which are considered very, very difficult to manage. So it depends what grass species you're talking. Some are considered high threat, and so all you can do is really try and work around your good areas of bushland and work out from there. You can either hand weed or spot spray and try and bag all the seed heads. And you've just got to keep at it over time and be persistent and do what you can with the time and resources that you've got. Yeah.
That's a great point, Liz. It is about, understanding that you can't do it all. And I mean, that goes back to Logan's original message in the video, is that you can't do everything. You can only just sort of plug away at it and be strategic about it, and don't lose sleep over it. From Jason, an interesting one. Can I plant exotic fruit trees such as bananas and mangoes in forested areas to temporarily provide food for native animals until the forest reestablishes?
We get this a little bit from some of the landholders on the north coast. So if you've got a conservation area through the BCT, which is a permanent level of protection, the answer's no within the conservation area, but you might have parts of the property that are not within the conservation area where you can plant fruit trees if you want to. So whether or not they provide food for certain animals during times of drought. I remember we did that during the drought, put out plates of fruit for some of the starving animals. So I see what you're getting at, but I guess that's more of a permaculture approach or a food forest approach, which you can do mixed uses of land for sure. But just not within the actual conservation area that's mapped on the title of your property.
Yeah, I would just add to that I do see a lot of people looking at exotic and introduced replacements for native species. Vevita grass is something that comes up a lot, and planting that as a creek stabilizer. But my answer usually comes back to quite often the natives are going to be faster growing and better suited to a natural area. And as Liz said, it's great to have good food resources on your property. But I'm a bit more of a purist, and then if I'm going to have a natural area, I'd rather keep it into local native species, because chances are they're going to grow the fastest and they're going to be the most resilient, and they're going to provide the food for the animals that we want to be there, rather than thinking of some other option. And chances are mango, there's going to be a native that's going to grow just as fast with a bit of fruit on it, and bananas, equally I think as well. Most of the king parrots will get in there.
Yeah, absolutely. They don't care if it's exotic or not.
No.
Here's a really great question, Liz. Something that I know you've been working on personally from Peter that asks: is there a simple template to do a property management plan to get started?
Yeah, so we're actually working on one of those right now, Peter, at the BCT, and we're hoping to get that approved fairly soon. And a really simplified version of what I was talking about, what a consultant would provide for you, but just something that landholders can try and get some baseline data of what the weed cover is across their land and what their targets are across time, so that they can actually keep track of their progress. So yeah, that's something that we'd really like to get finished soon.
Yeah. And a question with that notice, Liz, are there any out there at the moment? Are there any existing ones that you found in your sort of research?
You can always Google it. I've more seen ones that consultants have provided or
Yep.
contractors. Often experienced local bush regenerators can produce really, really excellent ones. So that's mainly what I've worked with in the past.
Yep. Okay, great. Thanks. Elizabeth is asking, what happens if you have a notifiable weed on your property and do DPI manage it? Is there a cost? I'm not sure. Logan, have you dealt much with DPI in your
So
experience?
DPI manage weeds through the local councils, through the weeds offices. So funding comes from them to manage those important and threatening weeds. And it's going to be different from LGA to LGA. In our LGA, for example, some of those notifiable weeds, the council is managing. So they're doing the control themselves because they're such high priority that there's no room to wait and try and get a landholder to do it themselves and to try and organise contractors. They essentially get out there and get on top of it right away. So that's always going to be a first port of call. But there's a lot of legislation around biosecurity and weeds. So you just need to understand that your rights and responsibilities. But if it's a notifiable weed, you really need to get onto the local weeds officer as soon as possible.
So yeah, you can
Great
notify
advice.
either the officer at council, or if that officer doesn't exist at your council, you can go straight to DPI.
Fantastic. There's a question here from Sophie and Ant that I'll just field really quickly. They asked about that they're looking to get a conservation agreement, and I'll just say straight up, the BCT is here to help. bct.nsw.gov.au is our website. info@bct.nsw.gov.au is where you can go to email about an expression of interest. Or alternatively, at the end of this webinar, there'll be a slide with my and Liz's email address that you can contact us. And depending on what region you're in, you'll be sort of contacted, put through to the local contact, and then we can work with you to do that. So that's great.
And
Stephen,
our 1300
sorry, go.
number. Our 1300 numbers 1300 992 688.
Nice work. I don't even know that off by heart, so good stuff. All right, so Stephen, our place is about 70% EPBC identified remnant rare forest. Is that the kind of thing that will show up, or do I just make sure I know? Oh, the protected matters search tool. Yes.
Yeah, no, the protected matters search tool is great, and is the Trees Near Me app. It will probably show up the vegetation you're talking about, but if the mapping's wrong or needs updating, it won't show up. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question fully, but yeah.
Great stuff. Horst asking best way to dispose of weeds. Can composting be used? That's a great question.
Lots of people stack up things in big sort of piles, things like that will rot down really easily, like trad or Madeira vine or really soft, fleshy things like that. And they put black plastic over them and just let the sun do the work, and they just turn into mush.
Mush it is. Anything else, Logan? Or are you good?
No, that's good. You just want to make sure you're getting it obviously to the right temperature, because composting is it's a chemical biological process that needs to get hot enough to be able to kill the seeds and those propagules that could be in those weeds as well.
Yep, that's it. Sophie and Ant asking, is there a resource or what's the best approach for removing cattle from pasture? How to manage what will happen immediately versus over time. We're about to take cattle off and not sure how to prepare. Now, that's a great question.
Well, a
Yeah.
lot of farmers, if you've got an area of native grassland or native woodland or something similar, try rotational grazing or pulse grazing. So they actually have a program whereby they don't let the cattle stay for very long on area, but they do let it graze. They do let the cattle graze down the weeds, and then they move them on to a different pasture. But if you're talking about removing the cattle permanently altogether, I'd be really careful about that pasture area if it's fenced off, because a big flush of weeds will come through the things that the cattle were eating. So you'll need to get on top of control. It depends what's in your area. It could be fireweed, it could be different shrubs, it could be weedy pasture grasses. So
The pastures could be an option to investigate, is using fire as a tool to stimulate. If you're looking to regenerate it with natural plants, fire could be one of those tools in the toolkit to try and stimulate a surge of native pioneering species that are adapted to fire. But that's something that you'd have to explore with the RFS or any local crews. There's often, or in our area, there's Indigenous crews who do burning to stimulate natural regeneration. So that might be an area where that could be something to look at.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
BCT website's got a resources section, which has got a lot of good guidelines and information. And there's one there on ecological burning. So it'd be worth checking out the BCT website and the resources section of that.
Exactly. And if Sophie and Ant, if you guys are looking at establishing agreement, we can, depending on your circumstance, we can sort of chat to you and we can sort of assist in that transition from a grazing system into sort of non-grazing. So yeah, keen to chat to you as in the future. That's awesome. Peter's asking, we've got a couple of minutes and these questions keep coming in, which is just fantastic. It really is. So best surfactant to use that is safe around waterways, please.
I know of the bioactive, I think it's called. Is that the right name, Logan? Bioactive form of Roundup that's approved for waterways.
That's right. Yeah.
It's supposed to be more sensitive to aquatic life forms, hence why it's a different makeup chemically to the regular Roundup. But again, I would always suggest using a licensed and experienced contractor to do any spraying around waterways, because they are sensitive areas in the landscape, and certain herbicides have a long life and they're not appropriate for use there. So take advice in those areas for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that I'd be spraying things around the waterways up here. Every situation is different, but if you're thinking about it spraying, you're killing big areas of plants quite quickly, and typically waterways don't respond too well to that, because plants, as Liz said in the presentation, could potentially hold banks together. Not only do their roots hold the soil like Rio, but also they draw water out of super saturated soil and stop or slow down that slumping effect. So I'd be considering, are there alternatives to spraying start with, and just be more strategic about the weeds that you take out, and maybe think of more of a cut and paint or scrape and paint method, but can't speak to every situation.
Yeah, or drilling larger woody things. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, I can see I've got literally 7 seconds, but I'm going to be sneaky because there's a lot of questions in here, and I think people are really taking value out of this today. So it's a question around serrated tussock in general, but like specifically, but I think in general, questions around the best time of year to bring a contractor on for week to help with, as Vic has called, a mass eradication exercise or as part of treatment. So what's the best time of year to treat these weeds? So I can then focus on follow up myself to keep the costs down. So when would you best tackle
Yeah,
it?
well, I'm seeing a lot of questions about specific weed species. Um, so I would definitely recommend looking at the New South Wales Wise website, or you can get it as an app on your phone. If you're walking around the paddocks, you can check. You can put in the common name of the weed, or the scientific name if you know it, and it'll tell you exactly how to control it. It gives you herbicide information. It gives you basically legal information about the Act, the Biosecurity Act, and what control is required per weed species. And that's a really great way of informing yourself about how to tackle different weeds, and also, yeah, using an experienced contractor who knows what they're talking about.
Fantastic, Liz, and parting words, Logan.
Uh,
Anything, mate?
Thanks so much for having me. Here, when we're
No
talking
pressure.
about pasture weeds, I'd be thinking, can we use, rather than just trying to focus on the weeds and kill them, can we just improve the pasture that we have? So that's one thing, but different in the natural area. And just that question on old ornament trees, should we thin it out? Typically, nature knows best, and those trees will work out the succession and the order to begin with. So if we go in there thinking we know which is going to be the healthiest longer term tree, then maybe we're cutting back what will be the late bloomer and come up and take over all the rest of it. So I'd be letting letting those natural areas regenerate on itself, and then way down the track think about thinning out for regenerative forestry if you need to. But that's a bigger question.
Great work, Logan. You're even asking questions as you answer them. You're going to put me out of a job. Fantastic stuff, Logan. Thanks, mate. Thank you. Thanks, Liz. Thanks for your time. And of course, we're up. Time's up now, guys. I hope the advice has proven valuable and can inspire land managers out there to stay motivated and think big picture while taking small steps. And rest assured, like previous webinars, I'll make it my mission to get back to those other questions that we didn't get to and elaborate on those where we feel like we could, provide more information. Please contact myself or Liz with any follow-up questions you might have. Our email addresses will be in that final slide. And with that, it's adios from us on the webinar front this year. We'll be back in 2023, starting with a contemporary look at artificial hollows as a means to provide habitat for endangered fauna. So what does the latest science say about fauna using artificial hollows? What's the deal with monitoring them? And as always, with limited time and budget, how can we maximize their effectiveness? We'll host this on Wednesday, February the 15th, and you can register for the event via the link that is going to be in the chat window. Yeah, so please come along for that one. As always, we value your feedback. So if you take the time, please, to complete a short survey also in the chat window, that would be fantastic. It always helps us going forward. So until February, enjoy the warmth and have a safe holiday season. Thanks again for watching and take care. Cheers.